Hello and welcome. Tonight we have an unsettling story from author Verrgasm. Thank you, Verrgasm, for permission to read your story called Touring the Effing Loony Bin. Now let's get into it. You please stop calling it that? Kim barked in a hushed tone at her husband as the couple trailed behind the head doctor of the institution. Well, that's what it is, Nick mumbled under his breath. He was out of his element there, to say the least. Every so often, a shriek or a deranged howl would erupt through one of the locked cell doors on either side. They sounded inhumane, making him shudder at the thought of his son being among them. More like a prison than a hospital. Right this way, please. Dr. Klutz motioned for the couple to follow him into his office. The bare white interiors of the halls, cramped administrative offices and common rooms, were replaced by an immediate sense of reassuring coziness as they stepped inside and were enveloped by the all-wooden furnishings. Large bookcases laden with psychological and philosophical texts, as well as numerous novels and biographies, stood floor to ceiling, covering 3/4 of the walls. They accentuated the small, meticulously trimmed bonsai trees centered behind the doctor on an antique little chest of drawers below the window, as he sat with his arms folded neatly atop his shiny mahogany desk. A sharp sliver of summer sunlight shone in overhead, and Nick felt somewhat at ease for the first time since they'd set foot in the old stony building. The air hung intoxicatingly with the aroma of old books and lingering sage incense, reminding him of his grandfather's study. "I'd like to assure you," Dr. Klutz began as he thumbed through the papers before picking out their son's file and having a good look at it over the rim of his glasses, "that this institution prides itself on a sense of deep rehabilitative calmness. Your son, with some of the issues he's been having, will more than certainly benefit from an extended stay. We have a consistently high turnover rate when it comes to insanity." Small mousy chuckle escaped the old man's thin lips, almost imperceptible under the thick gray mustache, like some benign ventriloquist trick. He excused his former attempt at levity with a short cough before continuing. "Well, insanity is a bit of a bad word for many people, and that's okay. It's one stricken with centuries of frightful connotations, some more appropriate than others. We get a great many young men struggling with a range of complex psychological and behavioral disorders, the majority of whom have acted out violently as a result." The couple listened intently, both clearly at their wits' end, but determined to do what was best for their boy. "So please, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask." Kim was the one who'd made the arrangements. The conversation she'd had over the phone with a nurse had calmed her initial reservations, but actually being there had revived a deep concern inside her. It was, after all, Lashbrook Psychiatric Hospital, formerly Lashbrook Asylum for the Criminally Insane, before the scandals. "Doctor," she started as tactfully as she could, "things really are different here now, aren't they? We heard about some of the things that happened to the patients, I mean." She squeezed her husband's hand tighter in hers. "Ah, yes. That's usually the first question. Perfectly understandable." Dr. Klutz removed his thick-frame glasses and rubbed the lenses tentatively, using a silk handkerchief retrieved from his shirt pocket. "While it was many years ago, I find it a societal imperative that we as a people not allow ourselves to forget such tragedies so quickly. I'm glad you brought it up, quite frankly. He slid the glasses back on, and the dark brown legs vanished into his bushy gray hair, what remained of it, around the sides anyway. The bald patch on top glistened, catching a blinding summer shimmer which adorned the pudgy elderly gentleman like a shining halo. Nick thought that if he looked directly at it, he might well go blind. He caught himself looking anyway before remembering that it was rude to stare so blatantly at people's bald spots. He glanced down at the floor in embarrassment as Dr. Kletz met his gaze. I haven't been head of this facility for very long. Most orderlies are relatively new as well. In fact, only a very small number of staff remain from those terrible old days, the majority of whom are nurses, and I assure you that they've all been long cleared of any wrongdoing. Nurses? Nick blurted before toning down his voice. But surely, when it came to the torture, surely nurses would have been present, right? Complicit even? Are any of those nurses still employed here? Dr. Kletz's face began to turn gray and solemn, like an ancient statue, choosing his answer carefully and summoning up tact of his own. As I said, all current staff have been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. All instances of malpractice of the kind you mention were directly overseen and sanctioned by my predecessor, Dr. Ghosh, a man who, thankfully, is no longer with us. Any staff present or who actively assisted in such acts were simply doing their job, as awful as that sounds. Just following orders, huh? The doctor read the outrage rising in Nick's voice, and he attempted to edify his position more clearly. That is what the court decided, yes. Now, I can well say this institution is very different indeed. They all are. For hundreds of years, places like this were seen as little more than somewhere to permanently discard society's human refuse. Wretched souls, deemed incurable, and so left to rot in their own filth and misery, manacled to the floor, or to the wall, or on a bed if they were fortunate enough. And the experiments that were performed, the tortures, as you call them, they were seen as crucial steps in the name of scientific progress, a necessary evil, if you will. Evil is the right word, Kim piped up. In retrospect, I would most certainly agree. The road to hell is often paved with the best intentions, something my father used to say. He was deployed on the Western Front during the war, a rather stoic man and very wise. At least, that's how I view him now. Again, in retrospect. The doctor seemed to lose his train of thought for a moment, staring beyond the couple into space. Nick cleared his throat, drawing Klex back to the present. But I digress. My apologies. Perhaps you'd be able to tell me a little bit more about your son. What is he like at home? Well, Kim began, impeded by a choke in her throat. She looked over at her husband, urging him to take the lead. Recently, Doctor, in all honesty, it's been a living hell. It's as if he doesn't have any interest in being part of the real world anymore. At first, he was skipping school, hanging around a bad crowd, but now it's just too much. Nick felt tears welling up in his own eyes, but he stifled them expertly, pushing it all deep down the way he'd been taught as a boy. Could you elaborate, please? Klex started to reach for a box of tissues before drawing back his hand after noticing the glare in Nick's eyes. I know these things can be difficult to discuss. No, it's all right, Doctor. Let's just get this over with. Nick drew in a deep breath, squeezing his partner's hand even tighter than she held his, so tight that Kim had to wiggle free of his grip due to the pain. He's been killing animals, cats, dogs, you name it. We found a pit in the woods behind our house. Kim erupted into bubbling tears, unable to contain her grief any longer. Clex held out the box and Nick took a few tissues and passed them along, surreptitiously holding one balled up in his palm just in case he also found himself in need of it. Well, that is certainly disconcerting. Can you tell me when it began? No, we can't. Nick found himself reminiscing against his will of simpler times before his son began to change, when they were still happy. But that pit, some of them were just bones, from what I could see under the mess of it all. Kim's cries intensified. She excused herself, choosing to wait in the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Nick knew he was on the verge of losing it himself. He turned to Dr. Kletz, eyes watering, his tone all but pleading. Please, doctor, will you help him? We'll do the best we can, Mr. Jones. You have my word on that. With that promise, Nick Jones joined his wife, and they collapsed into each other's wary embrace. Together, Nick and Kim sobbed quietly as they made their way back through the hospital grounds and out into the parking lot, where they sat side by side for some time. After a while, circling around doubts and trying everything they could to reason their way into some other option, any option, they got back into their car and began the drive home. Little did they know that their son was waiting for them on the couch, admittance letter for Lashbrook Psychiatric Hospital in one hand, Nick's gun grasped tightly in the other, shuddering with rage. Thank you so much for listening. As always, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, if you like this story, please check out the one on the screen now. It's called My Father Was the Scariest Man I Ever Knew, and it is a well-written, suspenseful story with a great plot twist. I loved how real it was, and I hope you do too.